Hello everyone and welcome to Talbot Rice Gallery. My name is James Clegg, I work at the gallery as a curator. It's been a really big week for us at Talbot Rice Gallery. We've just opened the exhibition The Accursed Share on Thursday night. It's an exhibition about debt, and I think what makes these opening weeks really special is that we get to bring artists that we've been working with for years to Edinburgh for the first time. So we get to meet them, we get to show them their work in the space, and of course we get to keep learning from them. I think when I think back over the 18 months of developing the show, one of the real highlights for me was being able to have long phone conversations with Cian Dayrit. The agenda for these conversations was to choose work for the exhibition, and we'd sometimes be talking about 8 to 10 artworks, but the phone calls would last for hours. And it's because with every detail in Cian's work, you feel like you're unlocking this bigger picture of how colonialism and capitalism continue to exploit people and damage people's lives. It's like an encyclopedia of ideas about how these different mechanisms affect people. Cian's first solo exhibition was called Blah Blah Archaeological Complex. And it was an exhibition that was exploring an ethnographic approach to other cultures, but it was centered on a fictive island called Blah Blah. So of course it was a way of testing out different methodologies for representing other cultures and other voices, but I think a very obvious instance of institutional critique. This was him poking fun at museums' desire to turn proto-cultures into these kind of narratives. And whilst his work has evolved now to include work with marginalised communities and work that does feature real-world political context, I think that sort of clever critical attitude is something that accompanies his practice as it goes from biennale to biennale and is exhibited in Berlin or New York or Los Angeles. He's an artist who's very good at, I think, having many different faces and knowing how to work in an exhibition context while also feeding a very direct on-the-ground practice that's essential to the political situation in the Philippines. So I'm now going to introduce Cian. Look forward to his talk, and as I say, please think of questions you might want to ask him at the end. Thank you. Cian.
Thanks so much, James. It's a real honor to be here. I'd like to thank Talbot Rice Gallery, James, the curator, and all the staff, and for you for being here today, this afternoon, and everyone who's going to be watching and taking interest in the work that I'm doing, or rather the work that we're doing. Yeah, it's really cold. I'm Cian, I'm from the Philippines, so part of this exhibition. I'm an artist, as you know. I'm also a student of geography, so that I guess in a way I'm also like an academic, but I've always just been sort of traversing around the peripheries of academia until I sort of just tried to dip 1 foot and 2 feet in, and at the same time also working and operating around different circles of activism in the Philippines. So I guess a lot of the work tries to look for intersections within these different positionalities. I grew up in the city, middle class, and then I got into university and access to different forms of knowledge and access to different voices. But a lot of my work actually speaks of what I don't directly feel, at least not directly, perhaps indirectly. In particular, a lot of the work sort of highlights the experiences of marginalized communities in the Philippines, such as like the peasantry, the farmers, the indigenous people or workers or labor unions and the urban poor, among others. And as James has sort of given an introduction and mentioned the exhibition Blah Blah Archaeological Complex, which was almost 10 years ago now, the work has sort of evolved into, from sort of interrogating and critiquing institutions such as museums and the state and tradition, and how these spaces and institutions and the objects that they use produce and reproduce notions of power and space. So a lot of the work which you see here in the room behind me, behind us, is pretty much like a selection of all different sort of formats that I've been working with as an artist. And if you'll notice, like a lot of it is also collaborative. I guess the positionality of an artist working in the studio, I'm trying to sort of expand that into finding ways on how to collaborate, not just in producing these objects that talk about complex narratives of struggle and oppression and exploitation, but also collaboration in the sense of how do we sort of gather all the information, all the stories from on the ground, and all the larger, more invisible workings of like global policy. So these very different things, how do they connect, and how can we all visualize them into the art object? So we can start with this particular piece, which you'll see there. I don't really have much work which deal with this format of like assemblage. But then it's called terra rationarium. Basically, it means the land inventory. So these take the form of little shrines that are shaped like houses. So in a way, these are presenting the intersections of the intimacy of the daily rituals of domesticity, and the intimacy of one's personal space. But at the same time, it also talks about the ritual component of belief systems and also the ideas of nation building, and to extend that further, the idea of empire building. So if we look at because to inventory, we can also sort of recognize this as a colonial imperative to measure or to survey the resources of the conquered land, if you will. And in this work, I calculate these gestures through the different themed panels. So if we look from right to left, the first one, right, yeah. The one on the rightmost sort of talks about the agrarian question, because in the Philippines, like vast tracts of land, like before I say that, like it's situated, it's an archipelago situated in between the Pacific Ocean and mainland China. So it's also within the Pacific Ring of Fire. So the land is very, very fertile and very, very mineral rich. So vast tracts of land within these archipelagos are actually historically been used for planting food crops. But then come colonial times, and then the Spanish introduced the Regalian Doctrine, which subdivided the land into friar estates. Ground control and land use has been like a contested idea ever since. So today, up to today, theoretically, almost most of the population is within the peasant sector, which means they are involved in livelihoods somehow related to food production, but that's also intersection with keeping the land and the soil healthy. But come colonial times and the systems of neoliberalism, a lot of the lands are owned and controlled by landed elites in collaboration with multinational corporations to plant cash crops, tropical food crops instead of food crops. So these cash crops are for export and thus not address issues of food security and land tenureship for most of the population. So in this panel here, you see details of oil palm and Cavendish bananas and pineapples and sugarcane, which are some of the most prominent crops that are being planted in these large plantations. So in a way, the farmers are turned into farm workers who are toiling in the land to plant crops that are not for their own consumption. So in a way, it's also like just a factory of food to feed into the global supply chain of tropical crops. The next one talks about mineral extraction. So geologically speaking, the land in our archipelago is very, very, very mineral rich. We have so much supply of like the fancy stuff like gold and silver, but also the very, very basic stuff like copper and nickel and other irons, which is more than what we need to industrialize several times over. But because of neoliberal policies, we are not allowed to extract and process these minerals. And instead, foreign companies extract it and then ship it out and then sell it back to us as finished product. Which leads to one of the other panels. But in the middle, the central panel talks about the military-industrial complex and how the Philippines, based on its location, based on its value in terms of geopolitics, is technically an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which has always been like within the interest of different imperial nations. Particularly of the America and their interest in the Indo-Pacific. But then as of late, we have been feeling a lot of aggression from China because of their interest within the seas and within the placement of the archipelago as well. So other than for military dominion, it's also a very strategic location and position for trade routes. In the flow of resources, which sort of leads us to talk about the fourth panel, which sort of represents the nation, or like the condition of the nation as a market for excess goods, particularly from the global north. So this sort of face of its economic condition also defines the politics and the culture in the Philippines, with not just the products that we consume or are supposedly accessible to us, but in worldviews. In a lot of the panels, there are many images and objects that hew to different colonial assimilations of our nation, like how we speak, the education that we receive, our diets, and all that stuff. On the fifth panel, lastly, this talks about the idea of labor or cheap labor. But in the case of the Philippines, other than cheap labor, it's also the export of labor. So in the 70s, there was these policies that sort of allowed rampant exporting of Filipino migrant workers to different countries all over the world, mostly Middle East and the rest of Southeast Asia. But then here in Europe and the UK, there are several Filipinos also, which I'm also constantly in connection with and trying to find ways on how to collaborate with the Filipino communities every time my works are shown in different contexts around. But then this is pretty much a direct and immediate and embodied manifestation of different forces at work in terms of the extraction of resources, the inventorying and surveying and measuring of colonial control. Of course, we're not under any colonial master now, but then that's not the case because we are still all within a condition of semi-colonialism or neo-colonialism. So yeah, this is this work, which I just sort of started with so I can get it out of the way because it's kind of a mouthful. So a lot of these works take the form of textile as well, or tapestry. So the one in the right is in Latin at the moment. I forget what it's called. The English translation is like neoliberal capitalism and the world as we know it, or the world as we not know it. If you notice, like I have a lot of textile works which use the Latin language. It's also a nod to different archaic, different time frames of knowledge production and power. So if I have some words, sometimes like statements or sometimes like jokes or any sort of phrase, I like run it through Google Translate and then use it. So a lot of it is sometimes badly translated or mistranslated, which I welcome very much because like I like the idea of these little inconsistencies and these little textures in how to sort of convey these general and big ideas or pronouncements. So if you can recognize the shape that's represented in the map, it's technically like a world map but inverted upside down, which is like a and it also sort of like highlights this idea of the global north and the global south, and just sort of like visualized. Of course, like if you Google it online or search wherever, like there are a lot of different maps that, or images or infographics that show like north and south, but I consulted with a list instead and tried to find the sort of like visualize it from my own like idea of what the north and south is based on the words other than different images. And then these are categorizations of land based on dominance over different resources, basically. But the waters, if you notice, are also kind of rendered neutral, which which at a point in history became the premise of conquest and colonial expansion, that the waters are neutral and of the commons. The water is of the commons. So today, the waters are actually contested, as it is access to trade routes and then for circulating goods and labor and information and any other abstraction or extension of life and power. So more than an inverted map, actually. I mean, it is a map, but I feel like it functions more as a banner, you know. Which sort of chants out this historical predicament of like classification of land based on power, based on economics, which are also like abstraction to life. And then this contrast is a reorientation of land, life, and justice or injustice, if you will. The one on the left side is entitled Adversarios Contradictores, or like facing contradictions. So basically, if you look at its composition, and you can take a closer look later on, its visual composition, its imagery adopts the visual language of the anting-antings or talismans, which were sort of used within different folk quasi-religious groups in the Philippines, which has also been sort of instrumental in the formation of early anti-colonial revolts. So it's not like, I guess like it's something like the visuality of very small sectarian belief systems and organized religions, which eventually sort of bled on to influence smaller like revolutionary gestures against the Spanish at the time. But then these objects are still used now within the peripheries of popular culture. A lot of Filipino artists actually also engage with this kind of visual language. But then my way of engaging with them is to just sort of adapt their visuality and materiality. So sometimes they take the format of brass amulets or prints on vestments that believers would sometimes wear with the belief that these objects would either protect them or give them good luck or whatnot. So if you notice also, a lot of the images are sort of referenced from Catholic and Christian imagery, which sort of is also a nod to Filipino visual language, because we are predominant, like not all, but predominantly Catholic. So regardless of one's involvement within the Catholic Church. It's sort of like a looming influence in terms of how we understand social structures, its hierarchies, its different formations in the life worlds of everyday people and the family and the state, actually. Yep. So if we go on to the next one, this is the tree here, and I'm showing on the two sides different iterations of this work, which has been also evolving since I started thinking about diagramming these ideas, which are spelled out in this textile. But then, like how I see it is, it's also an evolving diagram outlining these networks of underdevelopment and overexploitation of the Philippines, but not particularly looking into the Philippines only, but I guess trying to also relate to the entirety of the global South. And how do we connect the experience of like food insecurity and hunger and abject poverty, or even colonial mentality into sort of like more structural formations of policy and globalization and neocolonialism. And in this case, imperialism, bureaucrat capitalism, and feudalism. So a lot of these objects may seem like very definitive and kind of like strong things, but I think whenever I make an object and present it, it's also my way to sort of understand for myself and to like to gather different networks of knowledge and experiences and try to find ways on how to make objects out of them, but still have room for these ideas to evolve or to be updated or to be contested as well. So with these, with this work that you see outside, it's also in reaction to, reaction or reflection or response to the European tapestry motif of the Tree of Life. But then in this case, like it's sort of like killing itself, and coincidentally, the word depth is right smack in the middle, which somehow manifests the rot within this organism of our society. So a lot of the textile works, like all of the textile works, are done within different frequencies of collaboration. If you look closely at the works outside, the name of my collaborator who embroiders the work is always there. So that's us in the upper left. So his name is Henry, and then he works in the market nearby where my studio is. And we've been working together for a few years now, and his name is always credited there. I guess I'm also following the tradition of sort of crediting the engraver in antiquarian maps, wherein the cartographer's name is there, the engraver's name is there. And in a way, that's also like a gesture to somehow, like a gesture to democratize the practice as well. But then other than myself and Henry, Henry, by the way, works with his family in the market, like I said, but then he usually what they do is they make monograms for school uniforms and names on the face towels. And then when I started working with him, like I could come in with like a something, and then I think it became bigger and bigger. And it's I think like a pretty healthy collaboration. And then there's a lot of room for him to be intuitive in terms of how to respond to the images that I work with. So these things start out in my studio. Well, the creation, the production of these things start out in the studio, wherein I literally like sketch out the images and the words with crayons on a mounted sheet of fabric, and then I pass it on to Henry, and then he brings it back to me, and then I add to it, and then eventually like we add some appropriate objects like such as trinkets and medallions and things to not just embellish but also add to the context of their materiality and objectness. On some occasions, some of the work will have QR codes. So I would collect web-based links of related literature and videos and sometimes audio files that sort of add context to the work, or sometimes are the immediate references of the work in production, and then they are printed on fabric and then they are sewn on as patches. On some of the images here, like there are also some occasions wherein during the production of these textile works, I get to present it to the community that I am sort of relaying the messages of, or representing or co-representing. So in the image in the upper right that you see there, I'm presenting it to the community of different tribal leaders of the Aita communities in the Bataan province in the Philippines. It's also represented in one of the tapestries there. So it was before I sort of finished off the work, like I asked if it was appropriate for them to be represented in such a way, because a lot of the map-based works are working within the context or the idea of counter-mapping, which is challenging the traditional notions of cartography, which is always authored by the state or different positions of power, and in doing so, most of the time excludes the people who are actually living within the spaces represented. So counter-mapping addresses that contradiction, and in doing so subverts the notions of cartography to turn it around and have people represent themselves. So myself, being or coming from the positionality of the artist, and could also easily be within the positionality of authority, try to expand the context of my studio practice into the community and share authorship. And if anything, I am pretty much just relaying their stories into the objects that I make, and as they travel around in different contexts, such as where we are now. Yeah, on some occasions they are also presented or used as backdrops for events that are being talked about by the textile pieces themselves. So these events would be hosted by organizations and associations and people's organizations that I work with. This one you see in particular in the lower left was last November. It was an event commemorating the Hacienda Luisita massacre in 2004. There was a massacre of protesting farmers in a sugar plantation, and it was a plantation that was owned by two of our previous presidents. So that family, who also sort of authored the current agrarian reform program, was in fact like a large landed dynasty of oligarchs. So the agrarian reform program that they put up, which is still up now, is full of loopholes, actually. So it does not exactly address peasant landlessness. So anyway, the peasant workers, the sugar workers who were protesting at the time for land tenureship, for labor rights and land rights, were violently dispersed, and a number of them were killed at the moment. And until today, there is no justice. And such is the case for a lot of different, for most events such as this. I guess like it's an uneasy reality that these events aren't isolated things; they are systemic things. And how we sort of like tell these stories and give justice to the stories of these people, and find ways on how to continuously reassess and recontextualize these patterns to address these issues is up to a lot of different factors. So going back to sort of like representing narratives, like in the context of representing narratives or stories that are not accessible within the mainstream and broad strokes of national history and what gets talked about in mainstream media. Some of my work look into local histories of particular sectors that are not just silenced or not just voiceless, but rather deliberately silenced by larger institutions such as like the state or history. So this is a body of work which somehow personifies or talks about the local history of the Aita communities in the Bataan province, like the one I mentioned a while ago. So I was in residency with in a place there called Bellas Artes, but then in the residency, I spent a lot of time like connecting and immersing with the different communities, talking to different groups that work with them as well, and trying to find within different archives any mention of them in their in local history, but then there was very little. So the work became like a working archive, and then the objects that I produced in response to this like minute body of knowledge which we sort of like started within that project became some of these pieces. So these wooden heads are actually personified like events within their local history. What we see here are one is of an American soldier, one is of a Chinese pirate, and then the one that looks like a tree talks about a national greening program, which is like a program wherein the state goes into forested or semi-forested or deforested areas, and then displace the communities, and then with the premise of reforesting it. But then when the state reforests it and takes out the community, they plant invasive species that could be harvested and sold as lumber eventually, like plantation mahogany and things like that. So it's interesting to see the dynamic of the premise of reforestation and this premise of environmental impacts, but it also does not look into human rights and land issues. If anything, it aggravates it further. The one on the bottom, which looks like a chimney, talks about a particular nuclear power plant, the Bataan nuclear power plant in the Philippines. It's the only nuclear power plant in the Philippines, but then since it was finished, it was never used. It was decommissioned. So, of course, we had to borrow a lot of money for it to build it, but then it was never a good idea because we're in an earthquake zone, and then we cannot afford a steady supply of plutonium. So up until like 30 or so years, I'm not sure if we're still paying for it, but we had to pay for it a long time. So these four that is there at the room behind us. These are examples of that series that we selected to somehow talk about further this idea of depth and like dominance and subordination. So how do we sort of make sense out of these different events in history? How do we make sense of the spaces? I mean, you can still visit actually that power plant, and then there are people manning it, and then they will give you a tour. And with the new administration now, wherein the president now is the son of the president who started this, who was also a dictator that was ousted in '86. So there have been talks about putting it, like recommissioning this power plant, but then like the technology that was like installed in the power plant from decades back is not compatible with the technologies that are necessary to run a nuclear power plant now. If anything, it's like a retro 80s kind of place. So it's basically a very, very expensive artifact that we had to pay for a long time if we hadn't already paid for it completely at all. So there's a lot of push and pull within the stories that I'm trying to share, and then the different experiences of different peoples that I'm trying to convey with my work. So a lot of them sort of are very much like very nitty-gritty and very sort of detailed that sometimes I get lost in how to explain it. Do I explain it like on a more personal view, or do I explain it like as I am, like someone who grew up in the city and who just spent like a few afternoons talking to a community? Or do I explain it like on a more like zoomed out, complicated like perspective wherein I sort of through the lens of, say, policy and world history or geopolitics and things like that. I guess if anything, the works are constant attempts to put these together. And sometimes, as I said a while ago, like it's my way to understand it for myself. So these paintings here, they look like very crude line drawings. But then if you look closely, their background is actually a collage, and then I used a lot of copies of colonial era maps that I tore apart and randomly placed as a background. Excuse me. You can feel free to take a closer look after this presentation. But then, so the collaging randomly at the background is like a gesture to decolonize representations of space. And then the line drawings are, I guess, in a way, also a suggestion for the images that are narrative, if you will notice, to be read as text also, instead of just like a snapshot. But either way, they are speaking of very particular events, but at the same time, these events could be seen as patterns in our history. So, for example, the one we see here in the upper, if it's right with me, it's left in you. Oh, it's the same for me. Okay. Okay. So it's in my upper right. So I mean, so it's an example of an image of a story about another peasant massacre which happened in 2018. So farm workers in trying to sort of survive the working conditions of working in a plantation, particularly a sugar plantation. They try to use some of the land to plant food crops because if you know, sugarcane is technically a large species of grass, and it only grows once or twice a year. And in between planting and harvest, there's not much for the plantation workers to do. So that is when they sort of experience severe hunger and starvation, and that is what they call tiempos muertos, or the season of death and hunger. So at this time, some of the farmer associations, because they do get to organize and they do understand what they're dealing with, not just personally but generationally. So they organized, and then they attempted to do land cultivation to plant food crops for themselves. But of course, that is against the interest of the landowners. So they were like at night when they were resting, they were massacred by state forces. But of course, there was no accountability from the state. And in fact, it's not official state forces. They are paramilitary or armed goons hired by the landowner. So that also presents this stark, this difficult narrative of what kind or what forms of militarization or human rights violations are actually experienced by people, like by marginalized communities. Is it directly enacted by the state and its state forces, or is it directly enacted by paramilitary, which is an extension of military, which is an extension of the state, or armed goons or private armies hired by landed oligarchs who are also in collaboration with the state? So there are different frequencies of how we need to address legal, extra-legal, extrajudicial sort of issues, which are, in that case, like complicated narratives. So a lot of the plantation workers are actually agrarian reform beneficiaries. Like, they have papers to land, but then since there are a lot of loopholes to the agrarian reform program, and it is always a contested issue, it's not always enacted, they are not always installed. So I just said that the story of that one particular work as an example of the intricacies of the issue. There are so many stories to tell, but I'm not sure we have enough time for all of the little details, but yeah, we can have a conversation later also after. So the drawings you saw on those previous paintings are also sort of inspired, or like, well, at least visually, referencing a lot of the drawings of participant communities wherein I facilitated counter mapping exercise or workshops with. So much of my other work are based on the formats of maps. I try to tell these stories with how to talk about the spaces in these stories. And like a branch of my practice, other than like making objects, this other branch of my practice is somehow a little bit more related to a community-based approach. So since 2017, I've been giving out different workshops to farmer communities and indigenous peoples communities on how to make maps and how to sort of tell their own personal stories as an individual gesture, yet looking at like their experiences through the lens of collective or community. So their drawings usually come out looking like this. It's very linear, very narrative. There would be drawings, sometimes more detailed than others, and there would be text annotations wherein they plot out spaces of fear or safety or comfort or trauma. And then there would also be space for them to write their collective aspirations as a community. So, yeah, this is what some of them looks like. So this is a continuous project which I do sort of behind the scenes of my studio practice. I think I still count it as an artistic practice because whatever I do, I approach as a visual artist. May it be working within like quiet archives or within community settings. And so these community engagements happen and unfold in different contexts as well, sometimes within the university or sometimes within the countryside where most communities actually are, or sometimes they are within the city where there are protest camps. So I guess it's also important to note that whenever I sort of try to facilitate this workshop, it is always within the context of social justice and human rights. It is always particularly within groups that need to tell their stories, and it's not that I am imposing to the communities that, hey, draw maps, let's draw maps of our struggles. No, it's more of like a suggestion on like how else we can sort of articulate complicated narratives, which we all have been struggling with for a long time now. And so I wanted to show you some of these images also. So the one on the right is done by a collective called Ulirat, which is a collective of progressive geographers and GIS people, very young but very badass. And then the one in the middle is made by Ibon, which is a think tank, and then the third is made by Kilosang Mayo Uno, the May 1 movement, labor unions in the Philippines. So these are three examples of how the Philippine archipelago is used as an infographic to talk about different things. But then it also sort of offers a peek into how cartography is actually used to project progressive goals and to visualize data and to ground contradictions and to offer different formats of resistance by representing space and information like in a very clear way. I'd like to cite this one on the rightmost. Its little caption reads here, this is a map of mining tenements in the Philippines. It says, in a typical map, the cartographer would place a base map underneath the data to show the geographical context. However, the overwhelming abundance of mining tenements allows us to recognize that this is the Philippine archipelago. We found no need for a base map. So, you already recognize the shape of archipelago without the base map of the archipelago. That's what they're saying, based on the how much mining there is in the Philippines. And this is just to talk about mining. Of course, when they published this a few weeks ago, it had a lot of there were a lot of heated arguments between this particular representation because they were representing like existing and projected the mining tenements that are still under exploration, and some are mining tenements that have already been closed, but yet there is still the effect of the poisoned groundwater and so on and so forth. But then that was the point of this map, to show all of these different effects in their space and in their time. So it's important to note how maps are not just records of space, they are very much so records of time, and even more so, they are very much so records of power. So the second one, the contradiction of large land holdings amidst peasant landlessness. And then the May 1 movement map presents different labor strikes at a few years back, actually. So some mapping initiatives by different progressive groups are a little bit more thematic also in particular. So these two maps are of two different regions in the Philippines, one of which I have the one of Central Luzon, the one on right. I have a textile version with, but then this piece that was made by Counter Mapping PH, of which I'm also like a part of, and then the other one is made by Cordillera People's Alliance of the Cordillera region, the mountain range north of Manila. So these two maps are showing development aggression and militarization in the Philippines. Development aggression is when there are development projects, like supposedly development projects, but then in most, if not all cases, they displace local communities and affect the environment and ecosystems and other spheres with the premise of development. So these may take the form of real estate projects, infrastructure projects such as large dams and highways, sometimes mining also, so all different. So how do we sort of like understand the experiences of the people through these labels, development, aggression? I mean, you're not really thinking about those words when your ancestral land is being mined. So yeah. And then we sort of, yeah, I guess there's a lot of different levels of events or episodes wherein different kinds of violence, systemic, structural, or like immediate violence happens within these lands. How do we look at these shapes and sort of feel the humanity within all of these data, I guess. So that if anything, that's where I try to incorporate the language and workings of artistic practice into these narratives. So this is my version, my tapestry version of the Central Luzon map. So there are a lot of layers and details of the stories, some of which you can access through QR codes with your smartphones and internet access. But then, like I said, like maps are maybe static objects, but then they have a lot of room to be remade and reinterpreted and updated. So for the purpose of making an object, so this particular tapestry sort of maps out different historical events that has been felt until when this was made in 2021. A lot of the issues that are presented here are still happening today and are still ongoing, the struggles of which, yeah. Actually, just the other day, one of the issues there that are also represented in one of the QR codes, there is this development project called the New Clark City. So it's a new city that they are building from scratch, that the government is building from scratch, of course, with foreign loans and foreign partners. And then it's supposedly like the futuristic city, the smart and green city. It's supposed to generate like hundreds of thousands of jobs, sustainable, everything, you name it. But then it doesn't say that to build it, they will have to displace about like 20,000 families of farmers and indigenous people. And to build that, they have to flatten like entire mountain ranges. And for what? For investment. And to sort of like address the overcrowding cities, because they don't want to address like it's the proper resource management, basically. So yeah, it's sort of it's an ongoing thing. And then like we've been working with a lot of different communities within different sectors affected in this region. Right beside it is also like an ongoing large dam project. And then the past couple of days, there has been like several developments on state forces trying to sort of evict a community to bulldoze their crops to make way for like a few structures. But then like how I found out about it actually is because it was live streamed and it was circulated within our circles, and then we shared it and we made noise about it. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that although these are currently happening, very, very, very currently happening, we can recognize the power of visuality, of it being there live streamed, of people sharing these stories, to push it back. So one of the community leaders had a smartphone and internet access, and he was live streaming the whole thing while they were literally stopping the state forces and screaming for like the mayor to show himself and like show papers or proof that it was being done like justfully, whatever just means. And because there were a lot of people with like phones on and broadcasting at the moment, it had actually, for that afternoon, managed to push back the state forces. That's one guy with a phone in one afternoon. So maybe we can sort of participate by sharing these stories. I mean, I guess this is also just me trying to contextualize what I'm doing here. Because it does work, and the stories are important, but how do we share the stories by giving justice to them? And yeah, and of course, there are many forms of resistance in different gestures and different frequencies of language, like having a phone and being on the ground. But there is resistance in Congress, there is resistance in the courts, there's also resistance in the streets and the workplaces, in factory unions, in peasant associations. There is resistance in culture. Well, there's also armed resistance, which is also a tricky thing to talk about, but then it is a manifestation of how a people collectively try to survive, you know. Because like any living organism or group of living organisms, when you starve it and push it into a corner, it is bound to fight back. So there is the logic in that. There is nature in different forms of resistance. And yeah, I think this is the last slide. In the context of depth, I guess, I'd like to end with a line that is a chant in protests in the Philippines addressing militarization and the fascism of the state. And it goes, inutang na dugo sa pasistang rehimen, singilin pagbayarin. In English, it means debt of blood by the fascist state. Make them pay, make them pay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cian. It was incredibly informative and badass, if I can use your word for it. Does anyone have any questions for Cian? Well, we have him here. This could be a once in a sort of lifetime opportunity while he's in Edinburgh.
Hi, hello. I was just really interested by the level of community engagement that your projects have, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the community response, like when you presented your embroidered maps.
Right. Okay. There are a lot of different communities in this particular region that's represented by this particular map. I guess you can divide it into different sectors that you're wanting to represent or sort of extend their campaigns of. Like human rights groups, there's a human rights group for the region of Central Luzon that records and collects all the cases ongoing and sort of aids the victims into legal aid or paralegal aid or psychosocial aid or whatever. There are peasant groups, farmer associations of different provinces in different regions also, and also indigenous peoples groups. So I work with representatives of a bunch of different. How many is like a number that sort of varies because some are also members of others. But I just made sure that like a perspective is highlighted. So the perspective of the peasant, for example, in this region in particular, would mean farm workers working in plantations mostly. One, and two is small farm workers not working in plantations but are landless and are planting food crops in little fringes and trying to sort of put that in circulation as a livelihood. So I know of like 2 or 3 for each. And then on occasions wherein I get to go to communities to sort of spend a lot of time, as much as I can. But then in this particular, so I spent like 8 months in the Bataan, like that little peninsula at the bottom, and then in the middle, like several visits to talk to both indigenous and peasant organizations, like a few times also. I've never had the chance to live there, although this is just like a few hours away from Manila. Manila is right underneath. Collectives in which I am part of are also constantly involved with communities on the ground through engagements called BMI, or Basic Mass Integrations. It's part of the usual programming of activist groups in the Philippines. Yeah, other than those two, there's also fisher folk, small fisher folk, which I haven't had the chance to sort of immerse with, but I have a lot of correspondents who are working with fisher folk associations. So, as I also mentioned a while ago, the collaboration within the research and consultation goes as far as myself and the organizers that I know, and on most occasions as I can, the communities themselves. But then that's also a vague idea, the communities themselves, because like not all can be represented. I have very, very little information about the provinces that are like more facing the Pacific side. I haven't had too many opportunities to go there and engage with those organizations, but so yeah, it's a constant sort of development for myself. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but yes, I try to be as involved as I can, because it's also difficult to do it just from data. So once in a while, like while the work is ongoing, like I have to ask someone, like, is this, am I representing the region appropriately? So there's a quote here, for example, like the words there. It was a quote I got from one of the origin stories of one of the Aita elders in the Bataan province. But then that does not reflect the entirety of the region. So I asked other groups from other provinces, like, is it okay if I use this? And then they read through it, and then it sounds all right. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's been really fascinating. I just wanted to ask you, given the nature of the work and the politics of the work, have you ever experienced any forms of discrimination or harassment from the state, given that the work is clearly quite critical? Has that ever been something that you've come across?
Yeah, wasn't sure how I would talk about that or how these would affect me personally also, but generally my body of work is not comfortable for a lot of people in the Philippines, and yes. Okay, one such occasion is last year. We were in a community of, we were in a sugar plantation, helping out the sugar farmers, and then the plantation workers were actually agrarian reform beneficiaries, trying to reclaim their land. So they went through the courts and acquired the appropriate documents from the Department of Agrarian Reform. Their names were there in the Certificate of Land Ownership Award. We had printed it on large tarpaulin and put it in front of their hut. And then we went there to visit for a day to help them plant food crop, take out sugar, plant food crop. And if anything, we went there as cultural workers supporting this initiative. But the issue there also was that the local politician, the local mayor was also the one who was controlling that particular plantation or piece of land. So he, like, even though we had like all the legal documents, he got the regional, the local police to arrest and detain us. And we were detained for a few days and charged with a number of cases wherein we had to pay bail. There were about 90 something of us that were, we can't even directly say arrested yet because it wasn't a proper arrest. And we were charged with trumped-up charges to hold us, like malicious mischief and something quirky like that. Anyway, yeah, it was not funny. So we had to pay bail, and then when we were released, we still had to sort of go through court hearings, and it's actually an ongoing case because, like, after we paid bail, they put more charges on us, like land usurpation and illegal assembly, but that has not been used for decades now. So it's been dragging along, actually. So we have pending criminal cases. It's weird that it's going to be recorded. But yeah, this is what it looks like. The thing is, so like the case is slow. And what is supposed to happen is that these cases will move from the criminal court to the Agrarian Reform Office. Because once it moves from criminal court to Agrarian Reform Office, it becomes, it turns from a criminal case to agrarian reform dispute, and then we're off the hook. But that's just on us. The bigger thing is, are the peasants installed, or are the farmers installed already? Because that's what we were there for in the first place. So the land has been, the law has been passed on in the 80s. They were granted it in the early 90s. They only found out like more than a decade later. So their legal battle has been ongoing for a couple of years now, like 6 years or so. And then that was the first time that they wanted to sort of assert their rights via planting food crops, not sugarcane crops. So that was a planned, orchestrated thing that many supporters and advocates would go there. We were about like 45 artists and cultural workers. Some were scholars, some were foreign, some were media, some were paralegal. We were all detained, not read our rights. It's a story, actually, and it's an ongoing. I guess I'm also using it as a way to sort of understand the workings, because we hear a lot of these stories, but then how often are we really there? It was a good thing no one was stupid enough to sort of provoke any more violence, but it was still a 4-day ordeal. Yeah. Online, there's always repression online, but we just have to, I guess, navigate around all these different things. Yeah.
We can edit off the Q&A, Cian, just to make sure you're not arrested after this.
No, I
Or
think
keep you safe.
no, it's okay.
I mean, just to continue with Amanda's question, we were speaking to sort of Ariana Mercado from the Philippines, who I think you know, and she was saying like there's a relative level of protection if you're working within the arts context, but as soon as you step outside that, then it can become dangerous. But I mean, can you show these works in the Philippines?
I show a lot of very similar works, yeah. This piece in particular hasn't gone back to the Philippines. So, yeah, I guess important to note, when I make work, I'm not too much attached to the object because I can always show documentation, present it, or make another one, a more updated one. So the objects are like nomadic stories, but the stories are everywhere or could be everywhere. And then, yeah, that's a cool thing to note, actually, the positionality of being a contemporary artist. Talking about this, while we were there, there was a huge amount of support from international art circles. And that was a thing that we did not expect, actually, because it wasn't just me who was an artist. I mean, there were a lot of us, and a lot of us had work abroad as well, or collaborators abroad. And then the noise really helped. And then,
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I guess my question is also about the visualization of stories and kind of your creative process. So I was wondering whether you'd like to talk about how you convert all this rich analysis and research and surveying and experiences into like the visual objects, like you said, and how or when do you kind of determine whether that story is being given justice, and if so, how?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's always like the looming question whenever you hear a story or you read something. Because it's very loaded and I'm only one person that, I mean, like I can only do as much as an individual. But once I turn it into an object, which is an extension of the story, that's not the end of the story. So the story can also be passed on to different people who tell the story their own ways. So I mean, this is a lot of stories. This piece is a lot of stories. And it would maybe come out differently if I made films, if I made comics. But this is my language as an individual. So I'm not too pressured actually in terms of being the medium or vehicle for these stories. But I'd like for my research to bleed on to other people's work. I'd like for my engagement to sort of branch out to different people's engagements. And it can also be in an entirely different context. I mean, like I like addressing you guys from all the way across the world because like it's not enough time for me to detail everything, but at least to sort of like give an idea on like what's there and what can be done. On some occasions, like I feel like having my work shown in different countries and different contexts, in museums, may be a little off, but then there's always a conversation or an opportunity for a conversation that you cannot deny is very much important. And it is our job as cultural workers to expand our cultural practice. Yeah, so it's not up to me as an individual. Sorry. Yeah.
We've got one last question for you, Cian, before you do the official mic drop.
Oh, like I can't. This looks expensive.
Cian, thank you very much for sharing more about the Philippines. My own experience of the Philippines is, people from the Philippines, is working in a hospital, in lots of different hospitals, where the whole of the theatre team or majority of the nursing staff on the ward would be from the Philippines. And I'm just interested in you showing your work here in the UK, and it's really fascinating to, you know, when you were talking about the labour, and I was just wondering how the position of you showing your work in the UK and the Filipino communities, and I just want to say, hearing your accent is something that actually fills me with a lot of warmth and comfort, because it's an accent that I associate with people who are caring and kind, and I don't know how you feel about that.
That makes me feel nice. Yeah. Yes, I haven't been thinking about it at length until recently, actually. I've only really been showing or presenting my work for the past couple of years, maybe. Abroad, I don't know, 2018 or so. But then it wasn't until recently, that I realized that I could actually get in touch with the Filipino community. But then when you say the Filipino community, these are very segmented realms. And who am I interested in talking to? And like, I guess anyone really. But there are organizations that gather together like working class Filipinos, like nurses and domestic helper and overseas workers from the working class. And I guess from now on, it should be like common practice for me to, like prior to going, like really planning out meeting up with the groups such as Gabriela or Migrante, which have branches all over. Like there is Migrante Europe. So I texted them asking if there's anyone in Edinburgh. I have yet to get a reply. But then, I mean, if anything, that is what would be accessible to me unless I do more groundwork. But it's a start, definitely. There were some occasions wherein I did get to invite some members of these groups into like an art fair that I was participating in. And it was funny for them to be in an art fair on their day off, being domestic help. And then the week after next week, I'm going to Dubai to close this exhibition, wherein I'm presenting this textile piece about large dams. And then there are a lot of Filipinos there in Dubai, so I had gone into contacting Migrante and Gabriela also, and then they're very excited to meet up and have a workshop and have a snack. But then also the added layer of it being in a museum is funny. So if anything, like I like the idea of them knowing about being here, and it's up to them if they want to sort of like engage and how also. Like I have been, I think I'm starting a pretty interesting relationship with the Migrante and Gabriela organizations, because there's good representation all over the world. So yeah, but then, I mean, I wish I had more time. Yeah, I wish I had more time to really just hang out with them also.
Great, well thank you so much, Cian. I think it's nice to end on a question about care, because you know we've covered so much ground and so much context, and there's such a kind of intellectual labour in trying to understand what power does that I think we'll never fully get to the end of. But I think what your work really does, Cian, is it will make people care about these issues and care about things that are represented. It gives us that close contact with it. So as you heard Cian say earlier, like making some noise and being connected does offer some level of protection. So let's give Cian a really big round of applause.
Thank you very much for having me.